Let's talk about what really happens inside a man's mind when you go quiet, when you stop chasing, when you don't respond immediately, when you pull back and give space. You see, most people think ignoring a man is just about playing games, but if that's your intention, you've already lost. This isn't about manipulation. This is about self-respect, emotional power, and understanding something most women never get told. When you pull back, not from revenge, but from reclaiming your value, you trigger something in a man that no amount of affection or attention can. At first, let's be honest, he might not even notice. Maybe he's used to the validation. Maybe he's gotten too comfortable. He's used to you being the one who texts first, checks in, makes the plan, holds things together. And so when you go quiet, he brushes it off. He thinks, she'll be back. That's the first thought that hits his mind. She always comes back. Because that's the cycle he's been used to. He's used to you being emotionally available before he even has to ask. And so when that supply suddenly stops, his ego steps in first. He doesn't miss you, not yet. He just notices the absence of attention. But something deeper is brewing. Day 2, maybe 3. Still no call, no message. You're not watching his stories. You're not liking his posts. You're not reacting to his passive-aggressive texts. Silence. And now, suddenly, there's space for something powerful to emerge. Curiosity. He starts wondering, where did you go? Did you meet someone else? Are you over him? Did he matter at all? That confusion brews into a cocktail of self-doubt and reflection. And here's the twist. This isn't just about ego anymore. This is about realization. Because he starts to remember everything you brought into his life. The energy, the attention, the care, the excitement, the loyalty, all the things he took for granted when you were available on demand. Here's the truth. When you ignore a man from a place of power, not punishment, you give him the gift of clarity. That silence becomes louder than words. It says, I don't need you to see my worth. I already do. It says, I'm not afraid to walk away from anything that makes me feel like an option. And whether he admits it or not, that terrifies him, because for the first time, he's not in control of the emotional temperature. You are. Now, some men, let's be real, won't care. And that's not your loss. That's your redirection. If your absence means nothing to him, his presence meant nothing to you, that's your closure. Let it sting, but then let it go. Because here's what you need to understand. The right man doesn't need to be manipulated to notice you. He just needs to feel your absence enough to recognize your presence was never ordinary. That kind of silence doesn't push him away. It pulls him in. Not because you were cold, but because you were centered. Not because you were distant, but because you were disciplined enough to stop giving your energy to someone who didn't meet it with intention. When a high-value woman pulls away, a man either levels up or gets left behind. It's that simple. And I know what you might be thinking, but what if he forgets me? Sweetheart, if a man can forget you that easily, let him. You're not trying to haunt him. You're trying to heal yourself. You're trying to break free of the cycle of always proving, always pleasing, always being the emotional caretaker. That's not love. That's emotional labor. That's fear disguised as loyalty. And when you finally drop the need to chase, you rise into something so much more attractive, self-worth. Men don't fall for the woman who texts the most or tries the hardest. They fall for the woman who knows who she is without needing constant validation. The woman who is a reward, not a reaction. The woman who says, I am not here to convince you. I'm here to be seen, and if you can't do that, someone else will. That energy is magnetic. It doesn't scream. It doesn't chase. It simply exists, grounded and graceful, and it pulls the right man in like gravity. And let me tell you this, when you stop showing up for a man who stops showing up for you, he will feel it. He may not say it. He may try to act unbothered. He may post stories, flirt with someone new, pretend he's moved on. But late at night, when there's no noise to distract him, he will remember the way you made him feel. And he will wonder how he let that slip away. Some men won't recover from that realization, and some, if they're wise, will come back, not to reclaim the old dynamic, but to rise to your level. So no, ignoring a man isn't about games, it's about standards. It's about not entertaining bare minimum energy. It's about walking away with grace when your efforts are not reciprocated. And it's about trusting that your silence will say what your words no longer need to. I know what I bring. I know who I am. And I will not waste another second proving it to someone who's blind to it. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the strongest message is sent in your absence, and the man who truly values you will never need to lose you to realize your worth. But if he does, if he only learns your value when you're gone, then he was never ready for you in the first place. You're not a lesson, you're a partner. You're not here to wake him up, you're here to walk with someone already awake. So ignore him, not to hurt him, but to heal yourself. Ignore him. Not out of pride, but out of peace. And remember, your silence doesn't mean you don't care. It means you finally do, for you. Because this kind of power, this emotional detachment rooted in self-worth, is the opposite of desperation. It's not cold-hearted, it's centered. It doesn't come from bitterness, it comes from boundaries. You're not ignoring him to create confusion. You're choosing silence to create clarity. For yourself first. You're not seeking to make him anxious. You've simply stopped allowing your energy to be drained by uncertainty. That's not a tactic. That's transformation. You've reached a point where your peace means more than a half-hearted reply, where you'd rather protect your energy than constantly offer it to someone who doesn't know what to do with it. And that level of shift is powerful because it signals something deeper than frustration. It signals finality. It says, I'm no longer negotiating my worth. I'm no longer emotionally investing in someone who gives me crumbs and expects gratitude. That kind of shift is rare. Most people don't get there. They stay stuck in the loop, texting, over-explaining, checking stories, waiting for replies, analyzing tone. But the moment you break that loop, not out of anger, but out of evolution, you elevate. And when you elevate, you stop chasing closure and start giving it to yourself. And he feels that, not just in what you say or don't say, but in your silence, your detachment, your presence disappearing from his life. Suddenly, he's left with the echo of the space you once filled, not just physically, but emotionally. The way you showed up, the way you believed in him, the way you gave him access to a version of you that wasn't meant to be taken lightly. And when you stop showing up, not out of malice but maturity, he's left with a question he can't shake. Did I just lose someone who was never trying to impress me, but was actually irreplaceable? That's not the power of a game. That's the power of growth. That's the moment he realizes that your silence isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of strength. And that kind of strength, that's what keeps him up at night, because it wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It was simply the moment you stopped trying to prove your worth and started walking in it. At first, his ego does all the talking. It tells him she's just being emotional, or she'll come around, she always does. He convinces himself that your silence is temporary, that you're still orbiting around him whether or not you're speaking. He doesn't feel the loss yet. He only notices the disruption to the pattern. You're not texting first anymore. You're not reacting to his vague attempts at contact. You're not watching his stories or replying to his passive check-ins. And initially, he doesn't miss you. He misses the attention, the validation, the comfort of knowing someone was always there, waiting in the background. But then something interesting happens. Time passes and you're still quiet, still detached. You're not playing tug of war anymore. And without that emotional feedback loop, without you constantly reaffirming his place in your world, he starts to feel the emptiness. Not just the absence of a text or a call, but the absence of connection. That's when the ego begins to falter. The silence doesn't make him angry. It makes him curious. He begins to wonder if you've moved on, if someone else is now receiving the warmth he once took for granted. if the attention that once belonged to him is now being directed elsewhere. And that curiosity begins to eat at him because for the first time, he's forced to sit with himself, with the space you used to fill. And in that space, there's no noise, no comfort, no backup plan, just silence. And in that silence, questions rise. Not just where did she go, but why did she stop? That's when it shifts from ego to realization. He starts replaying the last conversations, starts remembering the energy you gave, the way you believed in him, the way you tried over and over again. He realizes it wasn't just attention he lost. It was something genuine, something solid. And it was never about the messages or replies. It was about the consistency, the care, the emotional investment you brought to the table. Now he's no longer brushing it off. Now he's wondering if he's the one who blew it, and that right there is the first crack in his armor. The moment he realizes your silence isn't a phase, it's a reflection of a choice not to engage in emotional dynamics that left you drained. And whether he admits it or not, that hits different, because he expected a pause, not a full stop. He thought you'd wait, not walk. And now that you have, it's no longer about missing attention. It's about missing you. And as more time passes, that space you created by pulling back begins to do something powerful. It begins to speak. It speaks in the way your name doesn't pop up on his phone anymore. It speaks in the way your energy no longer cushions his insecurities. And it speaks in the deafening stillness that now surrounds the parts of his life you once filled with presence, warmth, and reliability. Without you there to constantly reassure, to explain, to reach out, to soften the distance, he's finally left alone with his own behavior. And that's when the realization starts to take root. Not because you said something, but because your absence is now louder than anything you could have ever expressed in words. He begins to see you more clearly, ironically, when you're no longer in front of him. He starts remembering how effortlessly you gave, how loyal you were when he was inconsistent, how understanding you were even when you deserved clarity. The little things he never really paid attention to now echo in the silence. Your inside jokes, your late-night check-ins, the way you held emotional space even when you needed it yourself. He starts to remember not just the moments you were there, but the feeling of you, your presence, your energy, your kindness, and he starts to recognize just how much of it he took for granted. This reflection doesn't come immediately. It comes only when he's forced to sit in the emptiness, when he realizes that no one else is stepping in to fill the gap. He thought he had time. He thought you'd always be available. But now he's not just missing the habit, he's beginning to miss the connection. And more than that, he's beginning to realize that connection was never shallow. You weren't just another woman interested in him. You were someone who showed up, who cared deeply, who saw potential in him when even he didn't. And that awareness, it's both painful and powerful because it doesn't just make him miss you, it forces him to confront the reasons why he lost you. That space you created, it became a mirror that reflects everything he dismissed, avoided, or undervalued. And now that you're no longer there to soften it with your patience, he has no choice but to look at it, to sit with it, to feel it. And that kind of clarity, it changes something in him because it didn't come from confrontation. It came from your decision to stop showing up for someone who didn't show up for you. And that truth lingers longer than any argument ever could. That's the thing. Your silence becomes the ultimate act of self-respect. It's not fueled by anger. It's fueled by finally honoring your own emotional capacity. You stop over-explaining. You stop checking in to make sure he's okay. You stop giving access to a version of yourself that was never appreciated in the first place. And even though you may not say a word, the message is crystal clear. I don't need to chase validation to feel worthy. That's the kind of energy that doesn't beg to be noticed. It commands attention effortlessly. Not through loud reactions or dramatic exits, but through calm, consistent withdrawal. That's where your real power lies, in no longer fighting to be seen. He starts to realize that your silence is not confusion, it's certainty. It's the calm assurance of someone who knows what she deserves. Because people often think love is about how much you give, but it's just as much about what you don't allow. And when you stop responding, stop chasing, stop playing the emotional support role for someone who wasn't reciprocating, what you're really doing is showing him the boundary he never believed you'd enforce. And that's when the fear creeps in. Because if you're no longer proving yourself, it means you've remembered your value. And that's not something he can manipulate. It's unsettling for him because up until now, your emotional availability was his safety net. No matter how distant he became, you were still there, caring, checking in, hoping, explaining. And now that silence, it forces him to feel something he's avoided all along: accountability. Because for once, he doesn't get to hide behind your kindness. He doesn't get to escape into your forgiveness. He has to face the reality that you stepped back without a speech, without a warning, without giving him another chance to misunderstand your worth. And make no mistake, your silence holds more weight than your words ever did. Words can be ignored, but presence, once it's gone, once it's no longer felt, it creates a void. And the longer you stay in your power, the louder that void becomes. You're not bitter. You're not playing hard to get. You've just stopped placing yourself where you're treated like a backup plan. That is the boldest act of self-respect there is. And whether he admits it or not, he feels it. Because deep down, he knows the difference between someone who left out of spite and someone who walked away in strength. And the silence that follows that kind of strength. It echoes louder than any goodbye. And what's most revealing, what really separates a man who was truly invested from one who was just entertained, is what happens when your silence stretches out. Because some men, they don't come looking. They don't check in. They don't ask why you disappeared or wonder what they could have done differently. They just go quiet too. And while that might sting at first, it's actually your greatest clarity. Because someone who cared, someone who felt something real, doesn't just let you go without a thought. They don't feel your absence and shrug. If they do, then they were never holding on to you. They were holding on to the convenience of you. And that truth, while harsh, is freeing. It cuts through the noise. It ends the questions like, what if I'd tried harder? Or maybe he just needed space. No, if your silence doesn't create any shift in him, it's not a reflection of your worth. It's a revelation of his investment. A man who truly sees your value doesn't treat your distance as a break in the pattern. He treats it as a wake-up call. But the one who barely flinches, he was already 1 foot out. He just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. And you deserve to know that. You deserve to see what's real. Because sometimes your greatest act of self-love is simply stepping back and observing who reaches back and who vanishes. It's not a game. It's not a trap. It's honesty. It's allowing yourself to see who values your presence when it's no longer guaranteed. And when he doesn't show up, that's not a loss. It's liberation. Because now you're no longer stuck in the illusion of potential. You're no longer pouring into someone who was only ever giving you half of themselves. And that realization doesn't just heal you, it strengthens you. You stop internalizing the silence. You stop blaming yourself for his lack of effort. You start understanding that emotional detachment isn't rejection. It's revelation. It's the moment you realize that losing someone who didn't value you isn't heartbreak. It's clarity dressed as pain. And it allows you to move forward, not with resentment, but with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from finally seeing the truth. Because sometimes the gift is not in who stays, it's in who doesn't follow when you stop leading. And that's exactly where the shift becomes undeniable. Because a high-value woman doesn't chase, she chooses. She doesn't sit around waiting for breadcrumbs of effort or decoding mixed signals like puzzles with no prize. She's not driven by fear of losing him. She's fueled by the deep knowing that she is the prize. And that energy? It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't scream, doesn't demand, doesn't plead. It just is. It radiates through her calm, through her detachment, through her refusal to shrink just to keep someone interested. A man can sense that. He might not be able to name it, but he feels it. When a woman stops overcompensating, stops proving, stops managing both sides of the relationship, her entire presence becomes more attractive. Not because she's playing games, but because she's returned to herself. She's no longer reacting to his bare minimum. She's observing, she's evaluating. And that shift in posture, that non-reactive, confident stillness, throws off anyone who thought they could keep her tethered with inconsistency. Because the truth is, men aren't captivated by pressure. They're captivated by presence. And nothing is more magnetic than a woman who knows her worth and lives like it. She's not performing. She's not waiting for someone to realize. She's walking in her standards. And if someone rises to meet her, it's because they choose to, not because she pulled them. That difference is everything. And for the man on the receiving end, that realization either pulls him forward or pushes him out. But the woman who carries that energy doesn't worry about which. She doesn't have to. She understands that being chosen isn't something she earns. It's something someone has the privilege to do if they're ready. And if they're not, she doesn't chase clarity. She becomes it. That's the moment the game ends and the standard begins. Because she doesn't move through the world trying to prove she's enough. She knows she is. And that alone separates her from everyone still begging for bare minimum love. And as she stands in that truth, something even more powerful begins to unfold. He starts to feel the weight of what he lost. Not because she reminded him, but because the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. He meets other people. He talks to other women. Maybe he even convinces himself for a while that he's moved on. But deep down, there's this undeniable gap. Because no one matches the energy of a woman who genuinely cared without needing to control. No one brings the peace of someone who loved without performing. And suddenly, all the surface-level conversations and temporary distractions feel empty in comparison. That's when the echo hits him hardest, not just the absence of her presence, but the absence of what her presence represented. Stability, authenticity, a space where he could be seen, not just admired. A connection that wasn't based on convenience, but on genuine emotional substance. And now, without her in his life, he begins to realize that what he lost wasn't just a woman. It was a woman who showed up fully, who was rare, and who was real. He doesn't just miss the messages, the laughs, or the warmth. He misses the feeling of being genuinely cared for, even when he didn't deserve it. And here's the part he never saw coming. By the time he fully realizes all of this, she's no longer available to relive it. Because that kind of woman doesn't circle back to where she had to lose herself to be loved. She doesn't return to patterns that required her silence in order to be heard. Once she's healed, once she's grown, once she's seen herself clearly through the mirror of his absence, she no longer fits in the space he once kept her small in. And that becomes his greatest loss. Not just because she's gone, but because he now knows she won't come back. That's the part that humbles him. Not the silence itself, but the fact that it birthed a version of her that no longer needs to speak to be understood. She's not angry, she's not bitter, she's just done. And there's no force more final than the quiet strength of a woman who loved deeply, left gracefully, and rose silently. And as that realization settles in him, he starts to understand something even more uncomfortable. She was never trying to win him. She wasn't playing some strategic game of silence. She wasn't using distance as a trick to pull him closer. She was simply done handing herself over for potential. Her silence wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary, a deeply earned, calmly enforced boundary that said, I will no longer be available to someone who keeps me questioning. And that hits different because he's so used to women trying, proving, overextending just to be seen. But she walked away without a show. She didn't need closure. She became it. That's the kind of silence that redefines the dynamic entirely. Because now he's not wondering when she'll come back. He's wondering how he didn't see her clearly when she was right there. When she was consistent, when she was loyal, when she believed in him far more than he believed in himself. And that's the kind of regret that lingers. Because it wasn't just about what she gave. It was about who she was when she gave it. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't naive. She was full of grace. And now that she's pulled back, he finally sees how much that grace covered for his inconsistency, his indecision, his lack of effort. That's when he starts to feel not just the loss, but the weight of his own choices. Not because she made him feel guilty, but because she stopped making it easy to ignore the impact of his actions. And the silence, it amplifies all the moments he dismissed her concerns, all the times he brushed off her emotional labor, all the ways she made space for him while shrinking herself. And now, with her gone, there's no one left to absorb the emotional cost. He's left with all of it, not because she punished him, but because she finally protected herself. And that level of self-protection is what he never expected. He thought she'd always be there, always understanding, always hoping. But she outgrew the version of herself that needed to wait for someone to choose her. She chose herself, quietly, fully, finally. And that silence, it doesn't just make her unforgettable. It makes her unreachable in a way that haunts him far more than any argument ever could. And the most powerful part of all is that while he's stuck in reflection, trapped in the memory of who she was and what she gave, she's already evolving. She's not replaying the past like he is. She's rebuilding, quietly, stronger, wiser. She's not frozen in the version of herself that tolerated the bare minimum. She's rising into a woman who now demands more by simply being more. And while he's wondering what he could have done differently, she's realizing she never needed to be chosen by someone who couldn't even meet her halfway. The silence he once thought was passive was actually the beginning of her becoming untouchable. And that's the irony he never saw coming. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to prove a point. She didn't need to show him what he lost. Her glow-up was internal. She stopped asking why he didn't value her and started asking why she ever settled for being misunderstood in the first place. That shift, that's the real transformation. Because now, the next version of her, the one born from her silence, is no longer waiting for anyone to see her worth. She lives in it, fully, freely. And when a woman begins to live in her worth without needing external validation, she becomes a force no man can forget and very few can match. And that's when it fully clicks for him. The woman he took for granted is not the same woman he's now missing. She's not waiting behind a locked door. She's not watching the phone. She's not entertaining what-ifs. She's on the other side of growth. He finally understands that what she gave was a one-time offering, a version of her love, her effort, her belief that only existed for him at that time. And now that it's gone, it's not coming back. Not because she hates him, not because she's bitter, but because she learned the most powerful lesson of all. When you silence the noise, the wrong ones disappear, and the right version of you finally has room to breathe. And that's the ultimate truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you'll ever say is nothing at all. Silence isn't weakness. It isn't coldness. It isn't manipulation. It's maturity. It's the quiet declaration of self-worth that says, I no longer argue for the role I already showed up to play. When you stop chasing, explaining, and trying to be understood by someone who never tried to understand you, you reclaim the parts of yourself that you gave away in the name of hope. That silence becomes your turning point. It's not about making him miss you. It's about finally hearing yourself again. And maybe he'll look back one day and feel the weight of what he let slip through his fingers. Maybe he'll finally realize that your love wasn't ordinary, that your consistency, your loyalty, your heart was rare. But by then, you won't be the same woman who waited for him to see it. You'll be the woman who learned how to love herself louder than the silence he left you in. Because ignoring him wasn't the strategy. It was the moment you remembered who the hell you are. And once a woman remembers that, she doesn't chase love. She attracts it, on her terms, at her standard, without apology. That's the real power. That's what men really think when you ignore them. The ones who truly see your worth realize too late that your silence was never emptiness. It was evolution.